Thank you so much. This is
It's
so
great.
good. I feel like I don't want to edit this piece at all. I just want to just plop it into the world. You're wonderful. It's been 2 years
Yeah.
since the MeToo hashtag went viral. What has changed since then?
Everything. Everything
Yes.
has changed. Prior to the hashtag going viral, the work was very community based and where I was allowed to take it. Once it hit the internet and went viral, the world got to see that survivors are ready to speak up and speak out. But also this new platform, like I could never imagine that we'd have 2 years of a sustained dialogue about sexual violence in this country. We have this moment where we can talk about sexual violence. People can come forward and say that they've experienced and have a different response to it than they have in the past.
I feel like people have spoken about their experiences to a degree that I could never have imagined in my lifetime.
Absolutely. Even if you think about women who came forward, particularly women who came forward in bigger cases before Me Too went viral, right? I think very specifically of the Cosby case. The backlash that those women received coming forward. Not to say that women don't receive backlash now.
Sure.
It's a different world for people who want to say, this happened to me too.
It feels like it's less taboo.
It's less taboo. People's understanding of how pervasive it is has expanded, and so they can hear folks' stories differently.
When does it become taboo for sexual assaulters to become Supreme Court justices and presidents?
Yeah, I wish that was now. I'm just
Really wish for it.
I wish that was now. Yeah.
When you began this movement, what inspired you to start it?
I was working with little black girls in Selma, Alabama. Just too many of them had experiences with sexual violence. I was a little black girl who had experience with sexual violence, and it just felt like a moment had come where we needed to do something about it. One, it came from wanting to help the girls themselves, but also it felt like as a community we needed to respond to this because these were our children. These were people who lived in the community. Once we introduced it to the internet and like went on MySpace and started talking about it, and we realized, oh my gosh, this people in general just need this, right? Not just little black girls in Selma, Alabama. Grown people who have experienced sexual violence need somebody to say, I believe you, I hear you, and I get it. And it just became my life's work at that point.
Were you overwhelmed?
I was definitely overwhelmed. It was definitely overwhelming. I had no expectation to be inserted into this moment.
How would you describe the Me Too movement to like an alien from another planet or to the pervy uncle in your family?
This is a movement about healing and action. On the one hand, we want to make sure that survivors of sexual violence, people who have experienced it, have the resources they need to craft their own healing journey. We want to motivate people and galvanize the world so that they feel responsive to ending sexual violence. And the way that we end sexual violence is by consistently interrupting it. It's not about name calling. It's not about ending due process. It's not a witch hunt. It is really about people whose lives have been interrupted by this sexual violence, have been affected by it. And it's about us as a community responding to that.
Although I'm not opposed to the occasional witch hunt. You know,
Some people need to be smoked out.
they have their moment in time. When you say action, what do you mean?
Action can be something that you do every day. I volunteer once a week at this rape crisis center. I lobbied my congressperson to change this law. Micro actions is, I'm not going to listen to rape jokes. I'm not going to tolerate the guy in the locker room who's saying crude things. I'm going to interrupt my friend who calls every woman she knows a slut. Changing our language, changing our behavior, changing the way that we think about sexual violence. It's small things that we do that shift the culture.
Let's talk about the fact that we have so many conversations about the men.
The men.
Always the men. Sorry, fellas.
Me Too is not a woman's movement, right? This is a movement about survivors. And we acknowledge that men can be survivors. We also acknowledge that everybody doesn't identify as a man or a woman. So it's a movement for people who've experienced sexual violence. The reality is many of the perpetrators of sexual violence are men, and many of the survivors are women. That's not the total truth of the picture, but that's a reality. And because in this moment, when after Me Too went viral, and it went viral because of a man who was a perpetrator, and then several men after that, this focus on who the men are has dominated the narrative and the conversation. and it's appalling. There hasn't been a major study into why is it that 12 million people will respond to this hashtag in 24 hours. What's happening in America and around the world that this one thing is so pervasive that we could have 19 million tweets in a year? Mm-hmm. What we get instead is, can Louis C.K. still tell jokes?
Right.
You know?
What's going on with Matt Lauer's place in the Hamptons?
You know, like, the priority should be the people who experience the harm. Their lives have been torn apart by this.
Yes.
And I think we don't get enough information about that. What happens after you say Me Too?
Thank you.
You know?
Thank you for saying that. People are not interested enough in the fact that Christine Blasey Ford still lives God knows where in isolation, can't go back to work.
And is still being harassed and vilified, and it's just awful. Christine Blasey Ford is what a patriot looks like. Right. Anita Hill is what a patriot looks like. Mm-hmm. And yet we have all of these supposed patriots who are screaming about women like them undoing due process. Right. When actually they stood up for America. That's what an American does. They see something happening that can tear at the fabric of our country and say, I'm going to put myself literally on the line, my body, my reputation, my livelihood on the line for the sake of my country.
So what have been the major successes of the Me Too movement so far?
Tangibly, there have been several laws that have been passed, legislation that's been introduced. There's the Be Heard Act, and it will change the way sexual harassment in the workplace is dealt with. Several corporations have overhauled their policies, right? I look at those as victories, and I think people see those as tangible successes. I saw success after Kavanaugh's hearing. It was devastating to experience. And I was in the room when Dr. Blasey Ford was testifying, and I still, when I even think about it, feel like the wind gets knocked out of me, because it was just civics class come to life. Like, I was sitting in there watching these people who run our country. I was looking at their faces and watching them not care about this woman. And I mean across the board, because I don't think there was more care on one side than the other.
We watched it in our office, and it was complete quiet. I don't know a single woman who wasn't glued to the television. Glued.
It was just, because if you haven't experienced it, you know someone who has, or you can imagine what that feels like, or you've come close, you know. But I never thought that he wasn't going to get put on the Supreme Court.
Right.
I still thought what she did was important. The reason why I looked at it as a success, though, is because I watched the way that it galvanized folks around the country. The way people came and rallied around the issue and said that we will not have this sexual predator on our Supreme Court. When Anita Hill testified, we didn't have the same kind of response. No. She didn't get the same level of support. There wasn't the same kind of uprising from the community, from the people saying, this is appalling. And so you saw people coming out in the rain protesting. You saw them marching to the Supreme Court, taking over the Senate building, running up into senators' faces. I watched that and I thought, yeah, we are ready for this movement. People are ready to get up and get out and put their feet to the street about this issue. We're not just going to hashtag it. We're not just going to tweet about it. We're going to get out into the streets, and we're going to make sure people hear us and see us.
How do you keep that energy moving forward?
Every opportunity we have to connect with people, we take it. We take advantage of it, whether it's online or offline. And because of that, we now have an opportunity to bring people together. When we launched the Me Too Voter, it was an instant response to it, and to let me know people are always waiting for the next thing.
Tell me about Me Too Voter. What is that?
We kept having these conversations about our frustration over the lack of representation around sexual violence in the presidential election. So we're like, at the third debate, like, they're really not going to bring this question up? There was an article in the Washington Post that said, the country is not ready for a Me Too candidate. And I said, isn't that odd, since the country is full of people who actually said Me Too? People think of survivors as this offshoot group of people to the side to pity. But we are your neighbors, we are constituents, we are taxpayers, and we are voters. To be running for any position of leadership in this country and not speak to sexual violence, what your stance is on it, and I'm talking about, what are your policies and platforms, what things are you going to put in place that are both support and protect survivors, but also protect the people who haven't experienced sexual violence. For this to be one of the biggest issues of this decade, and it not be the same way you talk about gun violence or climate control or big ticket issues,
Sure.
it should be right up there. I shouldn't have to probe through your website to look for it.
You should be seeing it on the debate stage.
I should be seeing it on a debate stage.
So what does it mean to be a MeToo voter?
To be a Me Too voter means that you are somebody who cares about sexual violence, either because you experienced it or because you're just a human being who wants people not to experience violence, who will vote for the candidate who also prioritizes dealing with sexual violence, and who will legislate for things that protect people from sexual violence and also provide resources for people who've experienced it.
This feels like a missed opportunity to me for candidates to talk about something that is so meaningful to such a wide swath of the general public.
This is about having a modicum of courage.
I feel like you would see them all do backflips in the streets if 100 voters in Iowa gave them their emails. But there are 19 million people who are waiting to be heard and spoken to.
2 years ago now, millions of American people raised their hands and said, this happened to me too. And we are still waiting for a response. Those people's hands are still raised while we're waiting for the candidates and the people who say they want to be leaders in this country to decide how they're going to respond. And we have not had an effective response from that leadership. This is not a partisan issue. Sexual violence doesn't discriminate. There's not more violence on the blue side than the red side or vice versa. Mm-hmm. The Me Too voter is for everybody. Anybody who is running for any elected office in this country should be speaking to sexual violence on both sides of the aisle.
We are waiting for some leadership on this issue.
That would be nice.
At the national level. Just putting it out there.
Yeah.